Good morning. We're going to be in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, and then we're going to skip down to chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. And we might cover some of the stuff in between, before and after as well. We're just going to see what happens. I'm just kidding. I've got it all planned out. But we're open to the Spirit, so we'll see what happens. Before we get to the text, I want to take a moment and acknowledge something that's true for almost all of us. Some of you, I know, in this room are saints, and nothing bothers you. But for the rest of us, we have pet peeves. Anybody have pet peeves? Okay, we're going to acknowledge some pet peeves. This isn't necessarily my list, although I found myself in some of these things. But let's see if some of these hit for you. And we may have a little bit of audience participation. In fact, let's just start there. Somebody, if you want to share your pet peeve, raise your hand. Let's keep it PG, okay? We got some young ones in the room. Anybody have a pet peeve they want to share? Yes? People who don't put their shopping carts back where they go after they're done with their shopping. You took the effort to pop a wheelie and put it on the curb as if that makes it okay, but it doesn't. Okay, yes. Anyone else? Oh, when people don't pick up after their dogs. Yes. There may be a place or a time in history when it was okay for there to be waste lying about, but it is not this day. And it's not this place. So pick up after your dog. Yes. Yes. Dog-earing the corners of your books, okay? Yeah, so my mom's a librarian, and so yeah, I was raised to respect books. If you dog-ear the pages in your books, that's good. That's a good pet peeve. Okay, here's some others. Bad drivers. If you're in the left lane and there's no one in front of you and there's 10 cars behind you, then you are the problem. Move over. Okay? What about people who stand in the doorway to talk to their friends in a crowded space? Get out of the doorway. Stickers on fruit, on every piece of fruit. People who use the same knife for the peanut butter and the jelly. People who don't put the toothpaste cap back on. Now, I know I'm preaching now to some of you. When I'm on a flight and I have headphones on and a book in my hand and a highlighter in my hand and I'm leaned over my tray table reading and highlighting and the lady next to me says, "Hey, you want a muffin?" She's like, "No. I don't want any humans around right now. I'm in my zone," right? What about people in a public space who watch a video with the sound all the way up and they don't have headphones on, right? You're like, I did not sign up to watch your video. So put your headphones in. Being on hold. Your call is important to us, so please listen to this 40-minute flute solo. We all have things that frustrate us and annoy us. And those are some typical things. We have things that go a little bit deeper than that not just frustrate us, they make us angry, but they're still petty things. But then there's things that make us angry that are legitimate things, that it's not just us being petty, it's not just us being easily annoyed or easily frustrated or slow to anger. There are things that make us truly angry. And then there might be a few things, certainly for most of us at least, that take us to the point of outrage. What are those things? We currently live in a time that might be described as an outrage culture. Many people are outraged at something, or maybe almost everything, almost all the time. The question is why? And where does that outrage and that anger lead? What does it lead to? Last week we discussed that when people see who Jesus is and what he's come to do and what he says, they're either amazed, as we saw last week, or they are outraged. And today we're going to see how the religious leaders are outraged by what Jesus is saying and doing. And we're also going to see that Jesus also gets angry. And we're going to see the difference between the two. And so let's look at Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 1. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. They gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it, and then lowered the mat the man was lying on. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some teachers of the law were sitting there, thinking to themselves, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Immediately, Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts, and he said to them, "Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat and walk'? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he said to the man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." He got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, "We've never seen anything like this." And down in chapter 3, verse 1, another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. They began to plot how to kill Jesus. This is the guy who's healing people. He's the guy who will feed thousands of people. He's the one who will do all sorts of miraculous deeds. He will raise people from the dead. He will restore lives. And yet, this response to what he's saying and doing, they went out to plot and scheme how they might kill Jesus. Make no mistake, what Jesus was doing and saying was socially and religiously disruptive. He was causing problems and tension. His teaching and his actions often contradicted the religious traditions and teachings of his day. In Mark chapter 2, verse 16 and 17, a story that happens in between these two that we've read already this morning, Jesus is eating with and welcoming all kinds of messed up people. And the religious teachers are upset, and they say, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And in the stories after that, Jesus breaks religious rules involving fasting and not working on the Sabbath. He says that God is doing a new thing now that won't fit into the old categories that we have. New wine belongs in new wineskins, he says. And religious rules shouldn't rob people of life, but should help them flourish instead. And so he says that mankind wasn't made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for mankind, for human beings. And in the story we just read at the beginning, Jesus heals a man and forgives his sins. And the religious authorities are outraged. And their question is fair. Who does he think he is? Listen, it doesn't matter really what you've seen up to this point in what Jesus has done. There's categories, there's boxes, and only God has the right to judge people, to either proclaim them innocent or guilty. Listen, we still say it today. Have you ever heard somebody say, only God can judge me? As annoying as it might be to hear that, it's true. Only God is qualified to judge, because the rest of us have logs in our eyes, don't we? We're all complicit in the way that the world is broken. Even the most upright among us is broken and harbors inner thoughts and secrets and a past and bad attitudes and prejudices and biases of all kinds. All of us fall short of the glory of God. Only God can judge. Only God is qualified to forgive sins. And so when Jesus tells this man that his sins are forgiven, and the religious authorities say, who do you think that you are saying something like that? That's a fair question. They're outraged. Who is Jesus to pronounce forgiveness of sins? In the second story we read, Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath, a day when no work was allowed to be done according to their religious tradition, and the teachers are outraged. They had all these rules about what you could do on the Sabbath day because God had commanded them as an everlasting ordinance from generation to generation to keep the Sabbath day holy. The seventh day of the week, it would have been Saturday for the Jewish people and in the story of Israel. And so they were commanded to keep it as a holy day and not to do any work. No one in your household, none of your servants, none of your oxen or your animals, no one was supposed to do any work on the Sabbath day because God would end these commands by saying, because I am holy. And it was built right into the fabric of creation, this Sabbath day. God rested on the seventh day. And so this mattered. It mattered to his people. And even more than that, Israel had been in exile. They had been punished by God. They had been cast out by God because they had failed to uphold God's commandments. They had gone after other gods and worshiped idols. They had found economic and military security in other places other than in their God. They had turned away from him and relied on themselves. They had stopped worshiping God in the ways that God had instructed them to do. They had stopped obeying the Sabbath and they got carted off into exile. Their city and their towns and their nation was burned to the ground. And foreigners came in and lived there. And now finally God had brought them back from exile, and for 400 years they had lived in the land and they had been under the rule of oppressive empires and regimes, and they were waiting. God, are you ever going to come back to us? Are you ever going to show us your favor? And so these religious teachers started saying, you know what? If we would just show God once again that we're serious about following him and his commands, that's what got us into this mess. It's what's going to get us out of this mess. If we would just show God that we're serious, that we're all serious about following his commands, then he'll come back to us and he'll restore us to our rightful place and he'll make us a great people again, and we will be at the center of what God's doing in the world. That's a good desire. But it became oppressive in so many ways. Let's just get serious about following God almost always goes into toxic territory when all of us start looking at all the ways everyone else around us isn't getting quite as serious as we are. And that's certainly what happens. And they had made up all these rules. On the Sabbath day, you can't walk more than a certain distance from your house because that would be work, because you'd have to walk too far. But then somebody creative thought up this rule that if you took off your shoe at whatever that distance was, let's say it's a mile, you can walk a mile from your house, and once you get a mile, if you take off your shoe right there and you set it down, well, that shoe is part of you, it's part of what you own, it's part of your household, and so now this is where your house is, so now you can walk another mile. And it just gets silly and things like that, that you couldn't roll over and get out of bed in a certain way, because if you did that, it's too much work. And some of you with aging bodies are like, amen, that is work. And so they had all these regulations, all these things about, okay, you can do it this way, but you can't do it this way. And it just got to this point where it was completely absurd. And the Sabbath was no longer something meant to help God's people rest and find delight in Him and rest from their work and to find their value in their identity in God alone. It became a weight and a curse. I'm not trying to defend the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, but I get why they're upset with Jesus. They had zeal. They wanted to get things right. But the common problem with being zealous about getting things right is that we often end up putting the focus on forms and externals instead of function and the heart of the matter, and we end up overemphasizing policies and principles at the expense of people. Jesus angers the teachers of the law because he values people more than principles. He intentionally provokes the religious leaders because he values life more than law. And he gets in the face of the Pharisees because they prioritized religion over restoration. Sometimes, and listen, I'm going to meddle a little bit in our business now. Sometimes what's lawful isn't what's right. A little side example before I continue with that statement. Everything that Hitler did in his rise to power in Nazi Germany was technically, according to the law, lawful for him to do. He didn't break any laws in his rise to power. Now, some of you historians out there would be like, well, no, and we could argue about the semantics of that. But what's lawful isn't always what's right. And what's right is sometimes, maybe even many times, unlawful. And when that's the case, people whose hearts are shaped by love will find creative, risky, nonviolent, and compelling ways of being brave and misbehaving and not conforming and of breaking the rules. It's happened throughout history. It's happened in our own country from time to time. Jesus shows us that God desires mercy over sacrifice and compassion over rules. It doesn't mean that rules never matter to God. It doesn't mean that God has no expectations. But Jesus angers the teachers of the law because he values people more than principles. And their outrage, where does their outrage lead? That's a question that I posed at the beginning. Where does their outrage lead? It leads the Pharisees and the teachers of the law to tighten their grip on their control. Rather than asking if what Jesus is doing and saying might be a fresh new thing that they ought to pay attention to and listen to, they double down on what they think they can know, and they circle their wagons to fight for their power and their influence and their system that they have built and want to uphold. In other words, they're outraged because Jesus threatens their comfort and their privilege. And their response is to scheme and plot and eventually to wield violence, torture, and execution in order to preserve their system. There are two kinds of outrage. Self-righteous, manufactured outrage at something that disrupts my comfort. Or righteous anger that leads us to pursue justice for the sake of others. You see the difference? It's that second kind of anger that we see in Jesus in this story that we read in chapter 3. Did you catch it? Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and was deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. Jesus gets angry. But it's not the same kind of outrage that the religious teachers have. They're angry because someone has come in and threatened their privilege and their power and their system. Their anger is self-righteous. They're mad because someone is messing with the status quo that is working for them. But Jesus' anger is on behalf of someone else who's being left out or left behind. Jesus is angry because someone isn't getting what they need. He's angry because there's a lack of healing and forgiveness and restoration, and it could be different It should be different. But the shepherds of Israel, their hearts are stubborn. So let's talk about anger for a moment. Let's talk about our anger. Let me talk about your anger. What do you get angry about? Certainly, some of us are angry about peeling the sticker off the fruit. But in all seriousness, we are angry at all kinds of things. And hopefully, we've dispensed with the myth that just getting angry in and of itself is wrong. We see Jesus get angry. But what do you get angry about? Is your anger primarily about situations where you perceive that someone is disrupting your status quo or your privilege or your comfort? I really want you to wrestle with that question in the days to come. When you find yourself outraged by something, and listen, some of you aren't even going to get out the door this morning before that happens. Some of you are going to roll into Monday morning tomorrow, and the first thing you're going to do is you're going to open up a device and you're going to read something in the news, something that's happening around the world, something that's happening in our country, something that's happening in our city, something that someone said, something that somebody did or didn't do. And you're going to be angry, you're going to be disappointed, you might even be outraged. Is that outrage about your comfort? Or is your anger about, is your heart broken for the things that break God's heart? Do you see something happening that ought not to be happening? Someone powerful taking advantage of someone weak. Someone on the inside excluding someone on the outside, and you're saying in your heart, that's not right, that's not just, that's not the way things are supposed to be. And maybe a more important question is, what are you doing with that anger? Anger is power, it's energy, it's life force, it's something to be spent. And it, unlike lots of other kinds of our energy, seems to be almost self-generative on its own, doesn't it? The more you mull it around in there, the more you roll over it in your head, the more you think about it when you're brushing your teeth or when you're driving down the road, the more energy and steam that it gains. And it's almost like it just never runs out. And you might have little short outbursts where some of it leaks out on the people around you, but then it just fills right back up to the top. Maybe I'm just talking about myself here. Maybe that's you. The question is, what are you doing with your anger? Does your anger lead you to fight for things that matter? Does your anger generate within you the will to overcome discomfort so that another person can be healed or included or forgiven or liberated or welcomed? Is your anger inviting you to fight for the well-being of others? Outrage that doesn't lead us to justice and mercy on behalf of others is just wasted outrage. We don't see Jesus getting mad and then storming off and brooding. Instead, we see a clear progression. Something happens that's unjust. Jesus gets angry, and his anger leads him to do something good. And that brings me to some good news this morning. In so many of the good stories, good books, and good movies, there's a moment where the protagonist, the good guy, the good girl, they rise up. They've had enough. They've been pushed around, or someone's been mistreated long enough, and something snaps inside the protagonist's heart, and they stand up to do something about it. It can happen in all kinds of ways. It can be an injustice. It could be a relationship that they love someone and it's not going right. And then they rise up, they get angry, they get passionate, and they go and they try to make things right. I love in the movie Back to the Future where George McFly has his arm twisted behind his back by the bully Biff, who's just pushed the girl down to the ground and is laughing in her face, and you see the anger building and building in George McFly. And he summons up the courage and he clenches his fists and he punches the lights out of Biff, the bully, and gets the girl and kisses her, and everyone lives happily ever after. We love that, don't we? And listen, I know that we shouldn't glorify violence, and so many of our stories do that, but listen, I do think that there's something at least partially healthy about experiencing an outlet for those emotions that we acknowledge that we really have. Experiencing an outlet for those in story rather than finding an outlet for those in our real lives. And so if you need to watch George McFly, if you need to watch George McFly punch out Biff a couple of times so that you don't punch the lights out on your coworker, then watch the movie. That can be helpful sometimes. Again, we don't want to glorify violence, but what about in any Tom Cruise movie when he starts running real fast and yelling for people to get out of his way? Because he's got somewhere important to be. Everything is on the line and he's running and nobody runs like Tom Cruise. It's amazing. Or when the guy finds out that the girl he's in love with is about to get on a flight and fly away forever, and he speeds through traffic to get there in time to run to the gate at the airport when they used to let you still do those kinds of things, to catch her and to express his undying love. Those are the kinds of scenes that get our heart racing. It's exhilarating to see someone fighting for something that matters. In Princess Bride, when Wesley and Inigo and Fezzik stormed the castle to save Princess Buttercup. And you think Inigo Montoya is finally going to get vengeance for his father's death, and he's chasing the man with 6 fingers on his hand through the castle, and then the man with 6 fingers on his hand throws a dagger, and Inigo is pinned to the wall, and you think, oh no, he's lost. And then he pulls the dagger out, and he says, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. And something primal awakes in your soul, and you're like, yes, go get that man. And although there's a little bit of profanity in that scene, there's just a satisfaction when the good guy stands up and wins and beats the bully. When someone summons up the courage to tell the person they love how they really feel. When someone does something brave and risky and dangerous because there is so much on the line. There's a moment in history that the biblical writers say happens at the culmination of the ages, at the turning point of the ages, when God looked at the world and heartbroken at the sin and death and the way that evil runs rampant in the powers and systems of the world and how human beings had lived in captivity to sin, that something happens in God's heart and it stirs God to act and move, and God shows up in the flesh in the person of Jesus with a message for the world and for the forces of darkness. Enough is enough. And you can imagine that the Rocky music starts playing in the background. Cue the music. Jesus says enough. Darkness has had its say. It's had its time having the final word. And Jesus stands up. Jesus shows us who God is and what God is really like. If you want to make Jesus angry, hurt one of God's children. Jesus' anger at injustice is a result of his deep love for everyone. And I love how this is described in this last story of Mark chapter 3 that we haven't read yet this morning. In this story, Jesus' family comes to get him and to take him home because they think that he's out of his mind, that he's gone mad. And the religious teachers accuse Jesus of harnessing satanic and demonic power in order to do the miraculous things that he's doing. And Jesus' response to all of this is brilliant and powerful. In Mark chapter 3, verses 23 through 27, he says, "How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom can't stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he cannot stand. His end has come." Jesus is saying essentially, look, this is ridiculous that you would say that what I'm doing is coming from dark forces. I'm fighting the forces of darkness. And then he says in verse 27, "In fact, no one can enter a strong man's house without first tying him up. Then he can plunder the strong man's house." I think if we were to dwell on that line in the coming days and weeks, it would send chills down our spine. Jesus is saying, look, I'm not doing these things through some sort of dark power. I'm not doing tricks. Instead, Jesus says that the reason he has come is to enter the strong man's house and to tie him up. Jesus has come to rob Satan's house, to tie him up in the corner, and to take what is rightfully God's. He has come to bind the strong man, to bind the forces of evil, to tie them up, to gag their mouths, to chain them down to the floor in darkness, and to set free everyone who is broken and hurt and crying out for justice. That's what Jesus' anger leads him to. He shows up to stand up to the bullies and the powers and the forces of darkness and evil, and he comes to tie them up, showing that his love has no equal, that their power is no match for his mercy and his kindness. And that's what he does ultimately on the cross. He stands up to evil, but instead of all of our favorite revenge fantasies where the good guy punches the bad guy in the face, Jesus gives up his own life and surrenders his body to torment and rejection and suffering. But 3 days later, he rises again. And the empty tomb is the ultimate victory over the bullies of this world and over the evil one. And so a question for you this morning. When Jesus tells you to love your enemies, are you amazed or are you outraged? When he tells you that when somebody mistreats you, you should pray for them instead of getting revenge, that you should carry their pack an extra mile and turn the other cheek, is your response to be outraged and to say, Jesus, that just doesn't work in our world now? Or is it to be amazed that he's come to show us new life? When you find yourself getting angry, are you angry because somebody's stepped on your toes or disrupted your comfort? Or are you angry because the forces of darkness are running all over somebody? And you say, somebody ought to do something about that. And if that's you today, then the invitation is to take up the example of Jesus. And there is a sense in which we fight for good. We stand up for what's right. We stand in the gap and we do what's necessary for people who are innocent, who are being mistreated, for people who are being outcast, who are being left out to be included. We do what we have to do. And if in you that stirs up this righteous anger and like, yes, we're going to punch evil in the face and give it a black eye, then I want you to remember that the invitation is to do it the way Jesus does. Which means that you're not going to change that evil thing for good by doing evil. You're not going to win over an opponent by owning them in an argument and getting the last word in. You're not going to repair and heal a community or a nation when you win and you bury your opponents in the dust. Martin Luther King Jr. says that forgiveness is the only thing, it's the only force powerful enough. Love and forgiveness are the only forces powerful enough in the world to turn an enemy into a friend. I think he knew a little bit about what Jesus is talking about. And so today, may you be outraged. May you find your heart filled with anger and rage that someone doesn't feel welcome at the table of Jesus. And you know the truth that everyone is welcome at the table of Jesus. May that make you bitterly angry, and may you have the courage to do something about it. May it make you angry when you see someone's rights being deprived of them. May it make you angry enough to stand up and say, that's not right. You can have my rights instead. Wouldn't that be a refreshing change? Today, may you be filled with righteous indignation that there are people in the world who don't have clean water to drink. That there are children in our own neighborhoods who will go to bed tonight hungry. That there are children in our own city who are going to fail out of school this year and never return because they have no one to step in and help them and encourage them and help them find their value and their place. May it make us angry. And may we embrace the calling of Jesus to suffer on behalf of others. And may we bring life through our own death and suffering the way that Jesus does. And let those who have ears to hear the word of the Lord. I want to invite us as we lift up our voices over these next few moments. We're going to sing a song called The Arms, what's the name of the song, Taylor? Arms of Love. Thank you. I could tell halfway through that I wasn't going to get that right. As we remember that we are safe and secure, wrapped up in the loving arms of God. That we are his children because he has fought for us, that we might join him in fighting for the sake of others. And so may we feel that love and that embrace this morning, and may it stir within us boldness and courage to know that there's no safer place to live these things out than in the arms of our Savior. Jesus stood up. He entered the strong man's house and he tied him up that you and I might be set free, that we might be free at last. And oh, what good news it is that he has done exactly that. Let's sing together.